Morning, everyone. We'll be starting at 10 a.m. If you want to do an audio check, just raise your hand and I'll check your audio with you.
Hey folks, just doing an audio check.
You sound good? If you'd like to do an audio check, just raise your hand and I'll do a check with you. Chris King.
Good morning, Chris Coon, checking audio.
Yep, you sound good.
All right, thank you.
If you'd like to check your audio, just raise your hand and I'll help you out. Parisi?
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, sound good.
Thank you.
Chris Pat Savage?
Hey, Steve, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Thanks.
Sonny Gwynn?
Good morning.
Yep, you sound good, Sonny.
Thank you.
Skip Feller?
Good morning, Stephen. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, you sound good, Skip.
Thank you.
Mike Luisi?
Morning, everybody.
Yep, you sound good.
Stephen, is my audio still okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Thanks.
Robert Rule?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hear me there?
Yep, you sound good. Jim Gilmore?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Great, thanks.
James Fletcher?
Tell me it's not working.
It's working, James.
Audio check, Jason.
You sound good, Joe.
Jason, mic check here.
You sound good, John.
Thank you.
Good morning,
Before we
Stephen and
meeting, is there
Jason.
anyone
This
else
is
that'd like to
Rich.
check their mic?
Can you hear me? This is Rich.
Yeah, Rich, you sound good.
Thank you.
Rick Bellavance?
Greg?
All good.
Greg Hughes, would you like to try your mic?
Mr. Chairman.
Still can't hear you, Greg. I think you're muted on your end.
I am unmuted. You there?
Greg DiDomenico, we're working on a council member, Greg Hewitt.
Oh, my apologies.
Peter Hughes, you want to check your mic?
Good morning, and how about those Philadelphia Eagles? Eagles!
Since they didn't beat the Patriots this time, I'm okay with you celebrating.
All right, Wes, can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
All right, thank you.
Rick Bellavance?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, you sound great, Rick.
Great.
Michelle Duvall?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning. All right, seeing no more hands, let's get the February meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Council started. This will be a webinar only meeting. I think it was very good planning for Chris with a very light agenda that we had this meeting. Plus, with the weather we have coming in this afternoon and tonight, it might be ugly for traveling tomorrow. So, Chris, my hat is off to you. You did a good job. And with that, let's get started on our first agenda item, the Spiny Dogfish Accountability Measures Framework. Jason's going to introduce the purpose of this framework and review the range of alternatives that may be considered. Jason, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Originally, we were planning on spinning this up a little bit later in the year, but thought we had a little time to kind of just start the discussion and get some input from council members as we're starting to draft up alternatives. So going to give a bit of background, talk about the potential alternatives, and then jump into discussion with the council. So 5 aspects, kind of a background that I'm going to touch on, the goals of the action today, little information on the stock, and then the fishery, and then talk about some of the annual catch limits and accountability measures that are existing in the action, kind of how frameworks work for spiny dogfish. So first, goals for the action overall, really trying to minimize negative impacts to the fishery while maintaining catch limit accountability. We'll talk about, we had an accountability measure for the 2024 fishery and kind of that in context of the current quotas. And then the goal for today is just to review some of the preliminary alternatives that we've come up with and just get some direction from you all for staff as we continue development. So in terms of the stock with spiny dogfish, so the last assessment went through 2022. We were just about at the target in 2022. The biomass on the y-axis here is measured in millions of pups. That's a biomass measurement for this assessment. So again, in 2022, we were right at the target. And it's kind of a somewhat of a strange situation of it being relatively low in the time series, but at the target. It's because the assessment thinks the productivity of the stock is lower now than it has been at sometimes in the past. So even while in terms of the whole time series, biomass is relatively low, it's seems like it's predicted to be at its target in 2022. The assessment also had a series of projections since gotten some better recruitment and not in relatively recent history. The stock was then projected to increase to about 113% of its target by 2026. And that was even fishing at the overfishing limit. It was thought to increase, which is kind of an unusual situation. Normally, fishing at the overfishing limit would drive the stock to its target, but since we had some decent kind of recruitment filling into the biomass, even fishing at a relatively high rate, the projections from the assessment indicated some increase in the biomass after 2022, even fishing near the overfishing limit. This biomass, again, for the assessment is measured in terms of pups. The assessment also provides estimates of total biomass, and 2022 biomass was estimated to be around 728,000 metric tons. So again, the assessment's not saying that there's not a lot of spiny dogfish out there, just less than it's sometimes in the past, and then it's not anticipated to be highly productive in the near future after 2022. So that's biomass. Then the exploitation rate was relatively high before the FMP was created, and then low in the years after FMP creation, and then increasing a bit above what we now think the threshold is in recent past. But in the last year, the assessment was below the overfishing rate. And discussions with the stock assessment scientists, while they have pretty good confidence in the trends over time, the targets really depend on our understanding of spiny dogfish growth and production in recent past and in the future. Those two things, growth and production, are highly uncertain. So it wouldn't be surprising if these targets, especially the biomass target, changes in the future, because it's dependent upon what we think the growth of these fish and the stock is like, and there's a lot of uncertainty. We have a couple of research projects going on to try to better understand that, try to better understand aging, which will help us understand growth. But there's a lot of uncertainty with those currently. Just in terms of the ABCs, the acceptable biological catches that we've had in recent past, we're a bit below, right around 8,000 or a bit below in the most recent years, but that is a substantial reduction in the acceptable biological catches from our SSC that forms the upper limit on total catches over the last decade or so. Okay, a little background on fishery. The quota was very low with initiation of the FMP back around 2000. As the stock was increasing, landings kept up with the quota for a while, peaking in 2012, and then have been on an overall reduction in landings, well below the quota, except for 2019 and most of the years since 2012, although getting pretty close in that last year there. To the 2025 quota that we expect, it's in rulemaking process with NIMS right now. We're expecting a 2025 quota around 9.3 million pounds. This is just pulled this off the NIMS-GARFO quarter monitoring website for how the fishery has been operating in the current fishing year. The fishing year starts May 1 each year. And so the blue line here are the current year 2024 landings. This report was run last week. This is says data reported through February 5th, but there's often a bit of lag. So this is mostly landings through January, say. And so it's about maybe 1.5 million pounds off of last year. The last fishing year is in orange there. So, and we've got a few months left to go in the fishing year here. Just a little background on vessel participation. These are not all vessels. It's just vessels with any federal permit. And just tracking, we'd worked with an advisory panel a number of years ago just to create some bins of vessels that they thought kind of roughly would represent some different, kind of reasonably represent some different activity levels. We kind of created these 4 bins of kind of activity in a given year. And main thing highlighting here is, again, as landings had peaked in 2012, we've seen a substantial decline in vessel participation through the 2023 fishing year in terms of number of vessels with federal permits who are participating in any of these landings categories. Okay, so a little background on annual catch limits, ACLs, and accountability measures. Where do they come from? It's pretty much directly out of the Magnuson-Stevens Act that governs federal fisheries management. So Section 303 says that FMPs, fishery management plans, shall establish a mechanism for specifying annual catch limits in the plan and implementing regs or annual specifications such that overfishing does not occur, including measures to ensure accountability. So that's kind of the legal basis for why we have ACLs and AMs. There are 2 primary accountability measures for this fishery currently. Once a quota is reached, federal waters are closed for commercial fishing. And then kind of the topic of this action potentially is it says the exact amount in pounds by which the ACL, the annual catch limit, was exceeded shall be deducted as soon as possible from a subsequent single fishing year annual catch limit. And that's what occurred based on catch in 2023. We were over about 1 million pounds, and that got deducted from the current fishing year quota. So if we look at originally when we started the year, this quota, 10,249,260 pounds, was about 1 million pounds higher. But because we had an overage in 2023, that got deducted. That overage got deducted, and we're down to about 10.2 million pounds. So frameworks. The plan has a provision in it to do frameworks. They're generally faster than like a full amendment, but they're pretty much limited to amend measures previously used or considered. It says they have to occur over at least 2 meetings, and it's a little unclear about with these frameworks. It's like 2 total, or could you count committee member meetings? But when I reviewed recent frameworks for spiny dogfish, that they've really occurred at 2 meetings at the Mid-Atlantic and 2 meetings at New England. And then there's a long list of things that are frameworkable, including accountability measures. But there's also language in there that says if it's deemed to be a significant departure from previously contemplated measures or introducing new concepts, it still may have to do an amendment, even if it's in that list. If it's kind of deemed to be a big change or could cause a big change, you could still kind of be forced into the amendment route versus a framework. But the frameworks typically are a little more flexible and can occur a little faster. Okay, so that was some background on kind of setting the scene for what the fishery's been doing and kind of that accountability measure that got triggered kind of last year, kind of stimulated this thinking of, maybe this, as it's written right now, this exact amount always in pounds of any overage getting deducted, maybe considering some potential alternatives to that. So in the document right now, since these staff trying to brainstorm some alternatives, and there are 5 in there right now. No action is always an alternative. And then alternatives 2 and 3 are kind of, in my mind, kind of the core alternatives here. And there are some formulas in the document that kind of go through it, but it's really the kind of the 2 payback charts that are associated with those alternatives in the document are really the key thing here. And what they propose is that, if the stock is in good shape, there may not really be a need to do this pound for pound payback. We're at relatively low quotas. The fisheries, gotten close or above them in at least some of the recent years we're seeing. So, maybe these pound for pound paybacks right now may be unnecessarily disruptive. So alternative 2 says that if the stock is at 100% of its target or more, whoops, lost. Okay, there we go. If it's at 100% of its target or more, you'd have no payback. And if it's at 50% of its target, then you still have the 100% payback. And it just kind of slowly scales in between those. So it's saying, if the stock is in good shape, probably not a need to kind of biologically to have this pound for pound payback and relax that provision again a bit. Alternative 3 is very similar, except it still says if you're 100% or more, you don't pay back the overage. But instead of waiting to 50%, which is the overfished threshold, once you get down to 75% of your target, then you'd be at 100% payback. So alternatives 2 and 3 are very similar. They're just saying, you scale that payback based on where you are relative to the target. And we have some measures in some of our other FMPs that operate similarly for some payback provisions. So alternative 4 is considering using an averaging provision. And again, we have some similar measures like this in some of our other FMPs. This could be selected by itself or in addition to other alternatives like those payback scaling alternatives we just talked about. And it would, instead of considering year-to-year ACLs and year-to-year catches, it would be comparing a 3-year average of the ACLs and a 3-year average of the catches to determine paybacks or determine a scaled payback if it was combined with alternative 2 or 3. And again, it's like you get a random high discard estimate. Some years we have underages that may balance out some of the overages if you're taking an averaging approach. So again, it's trying to minimize the year-to-year disruption while still maintaining an accountability measure here to avoid overages. And what we really want to avoid is negative biological impacts of overages. And then alternative 5, like alternative 4, it could be selected by itself or in addition to other alternatives. And there's sometimes just like how the timing lines up of when we're doing a new assessment or projections. We may have already integrated a higher catch, maybe a catch that exceeded an ACL, into the assessment or into the projections. And that assessment then with higher catch is going to project, spit out lower ABCs, lower catches going forward. So the idea is that if that is, and this isn't, this really is kind of a case specific instance of when you have an assessment or projections being done, when data is available, when you might even know that you had an ACL overage. So it's not something that I think would pop up that often, but in the cases where it might occur and you've already essentially taken that hit on future ABCs, has been worked in the assessment of then not having a payback in that case to essentially avoid a double penalty for the fishery if that overage has already been integrated into the assessment and projected ABCs, because they're already going to be lower because of the overage. So those are the alternatives in the document. So before I kind of jump into discussion, questions, or input from the council. So next steps, staff will continue developing alternatives and analyses of potential impacts from the alternatives. We don't currently have plans for a fishery management action team creation and FMAT for this, but we've got a good monitoring committee for this FMP, so kind of rely on them for some input on technical analyses, and then bring to the June council meetings a little more refined framework document, and really try to come out of those June meetings with a final list of alternatives that then would be kind of further analyzed. So we'd have June meetings at both the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Council. Again, these alternatives are plus or minus whatever input you all provide, and then kind of nail down the list of alternatives in June for kind of full fleshing out and analysis. Looking for just general questions the council may have. If there are other alternatives you'd like to see considered, or kind of general approaches or suggestions for analyses related to this action. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Does anybody have any discussion, any ideas to bring forward? Anna?
Thanks. Where are high PSCs sort of taken into account, and is that typically not an issue with spiny dogfish, or are PSCs pretty low?
Yeah, and so the recreational catch and discards is, lower than commercial, but there are, I think, more than negligible recreational discards. And then we have uncertainty estimates on the commercial discards also, which are reported as CVs, but I think it's basically the same thing as the PSCs that you would see in rec in terms of a measure of precision. We take what we get as estimates as best available. They are totaled into the total catch. So there are no current provisions that say, like, if the PSEs or the CVs on discards are high, we're going to pay back less, or we're not going to pay. We get that information reported, and it kind of goes into our, I guess, concern about uncertainty. But there's no current provisions to like not count them or not pay them back currently if you have high PSEs. I don't know. I'll have to dig into like what the rec PSEs and the commercial discard CVs are for this. I don't know it offhand. So I'll add that information in for the next presentation.
Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Jason, for the presentation. So, I think it even says in the document, alternative two is kind of the summer flounder, scup, black sea bass approach to an accountability measure when the ACL has been exceeded. But just to clarify, for spiny dogfish, there's not, so for on the commercial side, when it comes to the quotas for those three species, like for summer flounder, there's a quota payback provision, regardless, for a state exceeding its state quota, regardless of, whether or not the total ACL has been exceeded. There's not a similar provision for spiny dogfish, right? It's just, even if the commercial quota hasn't been exceeded, we're still evaluating this just on an ACL basis currently. That is the no action alternative.
Yeah,
Correct?
it's just straight ACL overage or not. And yeah, and so I can add some detail on like exactly what part of summer flounder, like is it rec or commercial, that has those kind of relaxed payback provisions. So I'll add some clarity. I was just kind of using that as like, and that's kind of where I was searching for. So yeah, I'll be clear that that it wasn't necessarily like that's exactly how it works in summer flounder. So yeah, but there's nothing like that existing in any component of the spiny dogfish FMP.
Thank you.
Mike Pentney.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Michelle sort of touched on the point I was going to make, which is, that I think just the straight description that Jason provided of those three main alternatives, I think in principle, we understand the idea of when the stock is healthy, it's above its BMSY target, you might take a different approach for an ACL overage. But I had some concerns with the scaling, from 100% down to 50%. For example, suggesting that the stock might be at 55% of its target, almost at the overfished threshold, and you're not taking the full overage into account. And then Michelle hit on the point, which is, in the summer flounder example, we're automatically taking landings overages deductions into account. It's when the overage is based on the discard estimate that we might scale the amount of the deduction that we apply. And I think that's an important point to make sure that we're fully accounting for landings overages. I think we can support the idea of the 3-year average, particularly with the variability in discards. And I think that should be examined further. But I think that there's some more development, as Jason said, there's more work to be done between now and the next consideration. And I think we need to, be looking at this pretty closely to make sure we don't start going down a road that we can't approve. Thanks.
Rick Bellavance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Jason, for the presentation. Looking at the alternatives and the background document that you provided for us, it seems like the alternatives sort of focus around accountability measure B and C. And I think the alternatives are wide-ranging and appropriate, but I just was wondering if that was the focus of this framework, or if there was also an ability to look at accountability measure A in this document as well? If the answer to that is yes, then I have a question.
And what were you thinking? Could you just flag
Sure.
what by accountability measure A?
So in the document, it said accountability measure A, that's the one that closes the fishery. In the language that I had a question, I'll just ask it. It says no vessel may fish for or possess spiny dogfish. And I guess I just wanted some clarification of what that means and what the complications are to other fisheries if that accountability measure was selected. Like, does that mean any gear capable of catching dogfish can't go out, or is there a way to determine what fishing for dogfish is?
Gotcha. Yeah, I had focused on the payback issue. I see Mike Petney has his hand up. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's something potentially that could be added in terms of like some incidental possession limit or something like that. I'm not sure, but I'll
Okay, I was
Yeah,
just curious. Sorry.
No, I was going to say my hand was up. It was a legacy hand, but to try to answer the question, the intent of the how we interpret and apply that accountability measure for the commercial EEZ closure is similar to other quota-based fisheries where you're not allowed to possess. So we're saying don't target dogfish and you can't possess it either.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
And I think there's a little trade-off with like in mackerel, squid, butterfish, we have some of the quota reserved for incidental landings in some of those fisheries where like have like a stepped a kind of a step trip limit, but then there's also a portion of the quota that's kind of set aside for landings that happen after that point. So the current kind of method maximizes the quota available for that directed fishing, but then there's no possession afterwards. So there's that trade-off there. I haven't heard kind of concerns about. I don't think there's like there hasn't been expressed to me an interest in like some small scale incidental landings once the fishery closes, just based on the nature of the fishery. But it is something that we could potentially look at if folks wanted to.
Before I go to the audience, is there any more council discussion? Seeing none, John Whiteside.
Yes, good morning. I have a major concern if possession would be just you're hauling back and you haul up and you have dogfish and you're discarding 100% of it. If that's what is the intent here, you're going to shut down all fisheries because they're everywhere. And you just look at the discards, it goes across all gear types. So, you're looking at shutting down the scallop fishery and everything else. So that's a huge concern that I have.
Yeah, John, that's just the existing regulatory language. And again, Mike Petney can weigh in. I think the intent and application of that currently is just that people don't retain them once it's closed. But that's just the existing language on the books right now. No changes proposed there. But Mike Petney,
Okay,
am I
thanks.
correct that you're really just looking for folks not to retain and keep spiny dogfish based on that regulatory language?
Well, I think you hit on it. It's the existing language that we've had for, quite a while.
Sorry, I didn't realize.
James Fletcher.
Thank you. I have all the respect in the world for Jason, but I've got to ask this question. The dogfish plan started out as dogfish only. Then we went to female biomass. Then or now we're going to pups. And the Science Center research vessel does not go where Captain Rule found the pups or where the pups have been seen by the commercial fishing. So my question to you, what part of the agency has moved this to pups? And the second part of the question is, if we never estimate the biomass of male fish, which the catch usually runs around 5%, how can we come up with any type of payback? We were on female biomass. Now we're on pup biomass. Explain to me, because I've been in this for 30 years and I swear I do not understand. Thank you for your time, Jason, and I have a great deal of respect for you.
Yeah, in terms of the assessment and its kind of, so that was a research track assessment, and as it was developed and the models used for it, that was kind of what was decided upon as the unit that would be that would drive, you know, what's your target. But of course, it's keyed into the female biomass and the size distribution of the female biomass. So I think in terms of like exactly how that assessment is using the survey data and the landings data, and the limited information we have on growth to estimate, you know, what is all the spiny dogfish out there producing in terms of pups. You got to have to. I mean, our assessment lead Jason Boucher is online. You know, he can weigh in if he wants, but that might be like it's essentially like a presentation on the inner workings and statistical guts of the assessment. So I might kind of anything more than my kind of brief overview there. I think I'd maybe slide that to a separate discussion later. And if I've kind of mischaracterized that, Jason can weigh in. So again, overall, that's what the last research track moved this assessment towards. And then on the second question, the model projections are not assuming that, you know, it's like an equal number of males and females are caught. It's looking at the pattern of males and females. So we're not saying, I mean, I guess theoretically, if someone went out and landed a lot of males, that that would be that would count fully against the ACL, but that's not how the fishery operates. So while it's kind of like a theoretical concern that you could have someone all of a sudden land a ton of males and count against the ACL, and that's not what the projections are assuming would happen. I mean, it's a theoretical possibility, but I don't. That's not how catch has occurred in recent years, and so I think it'd be unlikely that you'd have a situation where you'd have a vastly different proportion of males coming in and counting against your ACL and blowing things up. I don't see that as super likely, but theoretically, it's a possibility, I suppose.
Sonia Fordham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I also have all this respect in the world for Jason. I want to thank him for the presentation. Just briefly on the alternatives discussed, I understand the council's interest in comparing the alternatives with the payback provisions of other Mid-Atlantic Council plans. But I wanted to take just the opportunity to underscore a key difference, and that's the exceptional inherent vulnerability of these sharks, as evidenced by the long history, the biomass history that we just saw. So essentially, completely different reproductive strategy from the fluke and sea bass, etc. Just wanted to remind you of that and appreciate the concerns expressed by the regional administrator. And finally, just remind you that after all this work and all these decades, this is actually one of the best managed shark fisheries in the world. And I think a lot of that came from trying to build in the precautionary approach that's warranted for that kind of life history into the management. So I would really, as you might imagine, hate to see that go too far backwards as we sort of whittle away the safeguards that are in place. So I just appreciate your consideration of those aspects. Thank you.
Anything else to bring to Jason?
Mr. Chair, based on the some of the concerns expressed by Mike and others, I'm kind of considering suggesting maybe, so the two alternatives here. This one went from no payback at 100% or greater biomass to full payback at 50%. This one went from 100% from no payback at 100% to full payback at 75. I'm wondering, at least for comparison purposes, maybe if the council would be interested in one that has no payback at 125% or greater of biomass, and then still sliding down to full payback at 75%. So it's like if the stock was above 125%, really, really high, then no payback. And then at 100% of biomass of target, there'd be, I think about 50% payback, and then sliding to full at 75. So, alternative 3 is more cautionary than alternative 2. It would just be, again, proposing not to remove any alternatives here, but maybe have a similar one with these that you start having some payback when you're below 125%. Again, I think would express, I think it would be just, it could address some of the concerns that the regional office mentioned, and I think just potentially be useful for comparison purposes, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think since we're still just working on alternatives, I think that would be great to have it in the document. Just give us one more option. Mike Penny?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're entertaining new types of alternatives, maybe Jason, could you consider something that's more comparable to the summer flounder example, where we first take into account any landings overages, and then if there's an ACL overage that has not been accounted for through a landings adjustment, then that's where we would apply the sort of scaling approach, and then you could have a variety of scaling approaches as you've laid out.
Yes, potentially. I mean, I think as I was crafting these, I was thinking, well, discards can be off in either direction. They may be too high or too low. Dead fish is dead fish. that's why for this, to me, when I was crafting this is like, yeah, have you gone over your catch target or not? I couldn't come up with a rationale for spiny dogfish, why it would matter if you caught too much based on landings or discards.
All right, Mike, do you still have hands still up for your legacy? Okay.
But
Anything else to bring?
I can have some. I'll maybe a way. And again, I'm not as familiar with those other plans, so maybe I'll kind of float it out to the monitoring committee, maybe, and see what folks the monitoring committee think about it, and then can at least have some discussion of it in the next go around when the councils look at it in June.
All right, with that, is there anything else any other ideas to bring to Jason? Seeing none, thank you very much, Jason. I guess we will be expecting to hear something from you in the June meeting.
Yeah, you may have gotten a late hand there.
Yep. Jim Fletcher?
Jason, is it possible that you could contact the remaining processor, find out what he needs? If we lose the last processor, this whole thing is for naught. So is it possible that you could contact him and find out what he needs to stay in business? And I'm sure Mr. Whiteside would be more than happy to help you. But we've got to keep the one processor there going, regardless of what, as you know, I don't think is correct. But is it possible that you could contact him and work that into this assessment some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll definitely have, he's on the advisory panel. And you know, I'm sure we'll have at least one advisory panel meeting before final action in the council. So they'll definitely have a chance to weigh in on that. I think they've kind of indicated in the past that you know, that any of these quotas put them in a, you know, that are scientifically justifiable currently are kind of put them in a tenuous position. But they'll definitely have an opportunity to reiterate that, I think, as we go through this process.
All right, seeing no more hands, thank you very much. Oh, I do see one more. Pierre? Pierre?
Yeah, just James, I'm here. I'm on the call. We've, reiterated and, beaten a dead horse that 13 million is really our ripcord. We're well below that. We're feeling the impacts of that this year. We felt the impacts of that last year. We're on a thread. Very, very, very tight thread. It doesn't look like, with the quota that was given, we're not going to hit our targets. And that's well below what we need to stay open. So it's just a matter of not when or if. It's just we can't really survive for much longer. So I don't know if that's next year or the following year, but we've really made our point that 13 million is the least amount we can keep this plant running, keep everybody employed, keep the freezers going, keep the trucks going. And again, I've beaten that with we've gone over that time and time again, and it just falls on deaf ears. So we may not be even having this conversation in 2026. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jason. And we will look forward to June.
Thank you. Take care.
Move on to our next agenda item, recreational sector separation and data collection amendment and recreational for hire control dates. Council will consider requesting that NOAA publish control dates for recreational for hire permits for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. And Kylie Dancy, whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Sound great.
And let me make sure my presentation's up correctly. Okay, so I have a brief presentation on the consideration of control dates for the for-hire fisheries for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. All right, get my slides advanced here. So back in December, the council, together with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Policy Board, considered and approved this draft scoping document for the recreational sector separation and data collection amendment. During the discussion, during that meeting, the council asked, a couple council members discussed whether the council should ask NIMS to publish control dates for the recreational for hire fisheries considered in this amendment. So summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. And this is a request that the council could make to limit speculative behavior in these fisheries if the council believes that options to modify for hire access may be needed to as part of this action or in the future. So a control date is a notice published in the Federal Register, published to inform the public that the council may consider action to limit participation in the fishery in the future. And it may use that control date as a reference point for, excuse me, determining access criteria for federal permit holders. So the purpose of a control date is to discourage speculative behavior while this is being considered. So it's a notice to the public of the possible intent to develop such measures. It does not, when a control date is published in the Federal Register, it does not have an immediate effect or necessarily a direct impact on fishing participants and their access. It's just something the council could choose to use as part of qualification criteria for any future access measures. However, the council, it would not be bound to use that exact control date and might use alternative dates or criteria. Or the council could ultimately decide not to develop such measures. And so establishing a control date does not commit the council to considering these types of measures or using the control date in such measures. So currently for these fisheries, the federal for hire permits are open access. And these fisheries do have control dates for the commercial fisheries, except scup does not have a recent one. We could not find any control dates that have been established for the recreational for hire fisheries. So this would be a new thing for these for hire fisheries. This table on the slide shows the existing commercial control dates, and some of those, just because they exist and they've been published doesn't necessarily mean it's been used in the development of any management measures, but those are the existing control dates for the commercial fisheries. And again, the for hire fisheries do not have any. So what's the relevance of this to the sector separation and data collection amendment? As we discussed in December, the amendment will consider approaches for recreational sector separation, which would be managing the for hire recreational fleet separately from the private and shore modes. And it will also consider recreational data collection and use. So the amendment is currently in the scoping phase. And currently, the scoping document does not include a focus on consideration of for hire limited entry as sort of a topic to be addressed in the amendment, although we did add a question for public feedback on the issue of whether some limitations in access might be needed pertaining to the sector separation issue. And the reason this came up was because the Council and Policy Board may want to consider options that might limit access for hire participants if these types of approaches are determined to be needed to achieve the amendment objectives. So again, we're in the scoping phase. It's very early in the amendment and there are no specific kind of draft options developed at this point, but For example, what came up at the last meeting was whether there might be a need to limit the ability of participants to add and drop federal for-hire permits whenever they would like to, which they currently have the ability to do. You can add and drop for-hire permits pretty much whenever. So the thought is that this could lead to participants frequently jumping between the for-hire and private shore fisheries in order to access more favorable regulations, and that would perhaps limit the effectiveness or the feasibility of such measures. So that's just an example of a way that the Council and Policy Board might determine that some type of access limitations may be needed in this amendment. But again, it's unclear at this time if that will be needed because we're so early in this amendment process. As mentioned, the amendment is currently in the scoping process. We are seeking feedback from the public on the scope of issues that should be addressed in the amendment and then possible approaches to addressing them. We have 5 scoping hearings scheduled between February 25th and March 5th, and written comments are being accepted through March 20th. And we do intend to have the council and the policy board consider scoping comments and describe the scope of the action at the April joint meeting. Following that meeting, the FMAT and PDT would then kind of take that discussion from the council and policy board and take that direction to develop draft options this summer. So the process for establishing a control date is pretty simple. The council would move to request that NIMS establish control dates for these fisheries, which is what the council should consider today with appropriate justification. And then if determined to be appropriate, NIMS would then publish an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. And the actual control date usually ends up being the date of that publication in the Federal Register, or sometimes the date of the motion, or another date that might be requested by the council. So I think it depends on how fast things can be turned around for the Federal Register notice, but could be a couple weeks or months before that ends up published. But that publication date usually ends up being the control date for the fisheries. And then there is a public comment period associated with that FR notice. And then that's about it. So again, this doesn't have any immediate impacts, but it does just provide a notice to the public of what might be considered, and the council may or may not choose to use it in future measures that could limit access to the fishery, such as permit qualification criteria or things of that nature. So that's about all I have, and just the objective of the discussion is for the council to consider whether it's necessary to make that request, and if so, to make a motion to request that NIMS establish that control date. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. Anna?
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. I have a question, a comment, and then I'm happy to make the motion. My question is there anything limiting us from making the control date as of today? I know, as you say, it's typically the date that it's published, but if there is a delay in the process and the publication doesn't actually happen in a couple months, that would still allow for some speculative behavior. So my preference, if Mike Petney was comfortable with it, would be to put a motion forth that set today as the control date. If that is not an option, then I, of course, would support setting a control date as soon as we are able to. Thank you.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, I was actually going to see if John Almeida can weigh in on that. My understanding, my experience is that every control date we've established has been the date of publication in the Federal Register.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me all right?
You sound fine.
Yeah, I think it might be problematic to have what you would be doing is establishing a retroactive for legal purposes, a retroactive control date if it's before the date that it's published. So I think it would be problematic.
Okay, if you want to take Michelle, and then I'll be ready to make a motion at your convenience.
Okie dokie. Jim Gilmore?
Thanks, Chairman. And same question along what Anna had brought up. So based upon the schedule, and from experience, if you're going to do a control date, you need to do that as soon as you can. So the schedule looked like the earliest we'd have a control date would be sometime in the fall. So that could have, some amount of impact on, what we're trying to avoid. So I think Mike answered and John answered the question, but I mean, again, how much of an impact is that going to have if we don't get a control date until, towards the end of this year? Thanks.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just out of curiosity, what are the, I'm just curious what the total number of permits are for these species?
I have I think there's, in the federal permits, I don't know if I have the totals on the slide, but I did have a request Garfo pull the total permits and active permits. Oh, we do have total permits on here for hire. So it varies by species, but in the 800 range.
Thanks, Kylie.
Anna?
Yeah, and Michelle can correct me if I'm wrong, but Michelle, in the South Atlantic, when we were talking about limited entry for the for-hire fleet, we did set a retroactive control date. So we announced it that we were going to talk about it in a meeting, and then that following meeting, we did set the control date for the for-hire permits as of the date that we were present in that meeting. Is that your recollection?
It is my recollection that was the discussion and conversation. I think I would need to go back and confirm that, but it's a good issue to raise, yes.
Mike Penny?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I'm actually looking at it right now. I'm looking at the announcement that we published an ANPR on February 8th of 2024, setting a control date of December 8th, 2023, at the request of the South Atlantic Council. So, clearly there is some degree of precedence for that. It's just not been something that we've ever done in the Greater Atlantic region. So it's something that we could look into, have a discussion with headquarters in the Southeast region in terms of the justification for that. So I guess my advice is that it may be possible, but we may not be able to repeat that, depending on what the guidance was and what the rationale was. But I also want to point out that, control dates are not binding. And, so certainly councils have the discretion to, use a control date as a point in time to distinguish, effort or participation in a fishery before and after. But there would also be nothing that would stop a council from using something else, possession of a permit, before the end of the calendar year, or some other metric. The fundamental issue that the councils have to address when developing any kind of limited access, is what's in the Magnuson Act, which is to taking into account present participation, however the council defines that, historical fishing practices and dependence on the fishery. So I think, control dates came about as a way to help the councils kind of distinguish what would be considered historical fishing practices from present participation in a fishery, by putting the industry on notice that fishing activity prior to a certain date might be considered differently than participation after that date. And also as a way to hopefully create a disincentive for a significant influx of fishing activity, when a council is developing a limited access program. But again, as long as the council has a rationale for whatever it uses to distinguish, present from historical participation, and whatever criteria the council sets up for who would qualify for any potential limited access permit, as long as there's a strong rationale that takes into account these aspects of the Magnuson Act, these requirements of the Magnuson Act, the control date may or may not actually be helpful in that, in doing that. So there's nothing magical per se about a control date. There are some concerns with or limitations of a control date, and that they do get what we call stale. And so, Kylie had the slide up of the existing control dates on the commercial fishery, one of which dates back to 1997. I think it would be pretty easy to argue that that control date is pretty darn stale, and would not be a suitable, date and time to distinguish, past participation from present participation in a future limited access permit consideration. So, they do get stale. They sometimes get updated, but the council is still, again, free to use, any rationale that it can come up with that's or any justification that's, creates a strong rationale for developing the qualification criteria.
Bobby Rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. If a motion is made today and passes that try to utilizes today's date or as a control date, and then for some reason it's found by the agency not to be that it can't be done that way, does it automatically revert to the date of publication, or do you have to go back and start at square one, and then at the next meeting or a later meeting, and then reintroduce the motion to use the publication date?
Mike Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think, that could be accommodated in the wording of the motion. So it could be, if the motion was written something along the lines of, requesting NIMS to establish a control date, as soon as possible, as early as today's date, if that's the will of the council. And then if we can't do that, but we have to do it on the date of publication, then that would be as soon as possible.
Anna.
I think that wording sounds amazing, Penny. So I would move that we request the agency to establish a control date for the summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish for hire licenses as soon as possible and as early as February 11th of 2025.
Sorry, Anna, can you repeat that? The last part of that?
Sure. Control dates for all four species will be establish it as soon as possible and as early as February 11th of 2025. That is my motion. Thank you.
Do we have a second for the motion? Skip Feller, are you seconding?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, before we have a discussion on the motion, Mike, is this worded correctly for what you guys need?
Yeah, I was just checking with John on mute. I mean, we understand the intent of the council here is that if we're able to, I'm just restating it for the record, make sure my understanding is consistent with the understanding of the maker of the motion is that, we will examine whether we could set a control date based on today's date, the date of the motion, if it passes. But that if we're unable to, for a policy reason, then we would strive to publish a control date, as soon as possible in the Federal Register. So if that's consistent with the intent, then I think we're all square. I would like to just ask for some additional discussion around the rationale for this. I understand, we understand what control dates are for, but typically when we publish a control date in the Federal Register, we need to explain to the public, to the industry, what the concerns are that are leading to the desire of the council to establish a control date, to some of the considerations that the council might entertain to make a decision about pursuing a limited access program. And so having some of that rationale and justification on the record today, I think would help us, prepare the package and get something through for the Federal Register.
Sonny Gwynn?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so just a question on this motion. So I'm looking at it and this isn't a control date on getting a for-hire permit. It's just a for-hire permit for these particular species. Is that correct? Is it?
Yes, this would only apply to federal for-hire permits for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish, and it would only be applicable if it were eventually used in some sort of further management decision by the council.
So I can still get a for-hire permit and go, say, cobia fishing or any other species I want. But when I go fishing for example, cobia or any other species, if I happen to catch a black sea bass, bluefish, summer flounder, or scup, I would have to throw it back overboard. Is that correct?
So this establishing the control date by itself doesn't have that effect, doesn't have that impact. It's simply a notice to the public that the council may consider future management measures that involve some kind of like limited access or measures to limit access in the for-hire fishery. It doesn't necessarily have to do with, so at a later point, the council may decide to take an action to, for example, put additional permit qualification criteria on federal for-hire permits for these species. And it depends what that criteria is, whether possession would be restricted in the future. But the establishment of the control date by itself does not do that.
Understandably, but at the end of this motion, if this were to pass and this to come in effect, I'm asking if I go fishing and I can't keep these species, I have a for-hire permit, I can fish for everything else but these species, correct?
The motion by itself does not do that. The motion by itself does not have any impact on access to these fisheries, or it doesn't have any immediate impact on existing for-hire permits. So if you have a for-hire permit for these species, you can fish for those species, retain those species under that permit. If in the future the council decided to take an action to limit access, it could be that future for-hire permits for these species are restricted, and if that were to happen, then it could limit the ability to retain these species on for-hire trips.
Right. Like I said, if I go fishing, I would have to throw these back. That's all. That's the question I'm kind of asking in the comment I'm kind of giving, and I want to find out. I think you've answered my question. Thanks.
Mike Luisi?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can maybe help Sonny out. So Sonny, one of the things, just to put it into perspective, so when we had the discussions years ago in Maryland about setting up state-specific spiny dogfish permits, we set some dates in time based on recommendations from the commercial industry, so that in the future we could use those dates for historical participation in the fishery. And so, Sonny, I think what we're looking at here is establishing a date that if we decide to use it in the future to make management adjustments with people who were permitted, it gives us some control to go in and to say to folks who maybe recently have joined that there were management considerations being discussed by the council. So after the date of after this is published and a control date is established, it gives the council the ability to implement that date in its rulemaking with a service for kind of separating the group of people who maybe had permits prior to that date or have received permits after that date, if we wanted to do something different with those individuals. So nobody's going to walk away from today's meeting without an ability to harvest fish if they're permitted for it. This is more of a control for us in the future, so that as we're developing this fishery management plan, we can pull this out if we need to use it later. And I think it's really important, and hopefully this speaks to some of what Mike Penny had asked for rationale for this. This is going to be a controversial topic as we discuss separating the fisheries, and I think any control that we can have as managers when we start having these debates is important, and I certainly plan to support the motion. Thank you. Hopefully that helped.
Sonny, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, excuse me. I understand all that. I just think my concern is looking at this up the road. If somebody goes fishing, they're going to still go fishing. But if they go fishing, they won't be able to keep these species as they're fishing for something else. And I think that's how I'm looking at it. An example, like me as a commercial fisherman, when I go spiny dog fishing, sometimes I catch a bluefish or a rockfish or these other fish. And that's what I'm just looking at. I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around on how it's going to work. But
yeah, I think, Sonny, I think those decisions, Sonny, are things that'll be made later down the road.
Okay. But yeah,
I don't think you need to
okay.
worry today that people aren't going to be able to fish.
Yeah. I'm not worried about them fishing. I'm worried about them throwing the fish back, but that's what I'm trying to get at. So, but I am going to support the motion. I'm just trying to get some of the things worked out. But thanks for that, Mike. Thank you.
Joe Cimino?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to put it on record in my support for this motion that, I think part of the reason for me considering this is if we're going to be serious or take sector separation seriously moving forward, then we're going to be looking at different targets, which means we may need to look at limited entry for these fisheries. And then the example that was given regarding the ability to jump in and out of these fisheries right now by getting rid of a permit and picking it back up, I think can complicate our understanding of these particular species and how we're managing them, the ability to prevent that like we do in so many other fisheries. And I think even, the individuals that have been invested, you see how many people hold the permit compared to how many are active. I think all of those folks that are still active and trying to make a living would appreciate, knowing the full world of those that are still active and participating. So I think those are some of the reasons I would like to put forward to Mr. Pentany on why we need this. Thank you.
Anna?
Thanks. And my primary reason for wanting this is really just to limit that speculative behavior as we start to discuss this. I think recreational sector separation is a very new topic for this area, and I think that people are going to be quite nervous about it while we, have these open discussions. And in order to protect those for hire fishermen that have been holding these permits for a long time. Part of sector separation is potentially, carving out a piece of the ACL, and we may go that route. We may not go that route. We may just, consider different bag limits for hire versus recreational. But all of those discussions are going to be, quite intense, and in order to really understand our universe when having these conversations, I think it's in our best interest to sort of have the opportunity to freeze the world as of today and see the current use of these permits, and not maybe have a speculative influx of 50 to hundreds of new permits for us to contend with while we're taking these matters into consideration. So that is my primary reason for wanting to see this move forward. Thank you.
Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll also echo my support for this motion, though I share many of the concerns that have been shared already. From a state that has quite a bit of experience with control dates, setting them up early as is being proposed here, and what comes with that in public response. We do have a bit of a long road ahead of us. I also share some of the concerns with Sunny as far as looking at regulatory discard issues to make sure we do everything we can to mitigate against that if we go down a path where we actually have to enact something based on the control date. But I will support the motion.
Rick Bellavance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Up in New England, we have a control date in place for our Northeast multi-species charter party fishery. It was in place a long time ago, and it's been refreshed at least once that I can recall. And we entertained a limited access action in New England a few years back, and it all kind of played in. Ultimately, the council as a body chose not to go down that road, but it was all helpful in the conversation. And I think it's an important tool in the toolbox, and I would support the motion. Thanks.
Before I go to the audience, any more discussion from the council? Seeing none, James Fletcher.
I've been seeing the control date used in the commercial fishery, and I do not have a dog in this fight. But North Carolina and Virginia have a fairly large number of people that carry eco parties and this, that, and the other, and they're going to larger boats to be able to go offshore. If you're going to publish this control date, publish it 2 years in advance and give these people notice. What you're doing is establishing something that in 5 to 7 years will be bought and sold. And it is just like the federal permits and the state permits on the commercial side. Give 2 years of advance notice that you're going to use this control date, because this is definitely unfair. And rather than going through this, why not try to increase the number of fish out there? Your fisheries management, but tell me one case where there has been an example of increasing the number of fish through artificial propagation. You got striped bass, but what you came out with was a hybrid fish. So rather than going down this, let me get back to the thing. Publish this 2 years in advance and I don't represent those dingbats that carry parties, but give them 2 years notice. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion on the motion? Emerson Hasbrook?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know this action is relative to 4 higher vessels operating in the EEZ for these species. So I'm just wondering, what's the expectation on this relative to the commission in the states? Many of the 4 higher vessels for these species may operate in state waters only and may not want to obtain federal permits for these species. So I'm just wondering if anyone might provide some insight in terms of what the expectation is, again, for the commission in the states. Thank you.
Kylie, do you have an answer?
I was gonna potentially defer to commission staff on that. I know commission staff has been sort of talking to the states about, current existing permit structures and what this might mean or whether it would have any impact on the states. So maybe commission staff can chime in here.
Chelsea?
Thanks, Kylie. Emerson, I don't have an answer for that right this second, but we did send out about 2 weeks ago a survey to all the states just to get a little bit more information about their state specific for hire permits for these 4 species and if they're already limited entry and some more information. So once we get all the responses back to that survey, Tracy and I will kind of create a document that perhaps will provide some more clarity and information about how this would impact state boats or vessels that are only operating in state waters in specific states. So that's ongoing right now, but as of right now, we're not entirely sure.
Adam Nowalski?
Morning. Thank you very much for giving myself the opportunity to comment here as part of the public and as a commissioner for the ASMFC today. I had not reached out to very many individuals about this in advance of today's meeting. I did want to hear the conversation around the table, particularly the rationale for the need to go ahead and have the service publish this control date. And after hearing the discussion, I'm still having trouble coming to terms that there is that justification for any other reason other than some people believe that limited access is on the table moving forward, and they want this in place in order to protect their interests. I think the council has to do a better job in providing a justification than that. This is not a case where we're seeing some huge increase in recent permit activity. The slides shown here today have shown very static number of permits, both total and active. We've certainly already heard some confusion around the table about what this will mean. The news of this going out will create additional confusion within the community. We're still in the council and commission are still in the scoping stage of sector separation, so we don't even have a definitive action that the council and commission, this being a council action only here today, to deliberate and consider. I'm also concerned that what this is going to cause people to do is those that are concerned about speculative behavior. It's not, I understand that the permits, and having had multiple of these for a long, long time, multiple decades here, I understand that they're open access, but there are requirements in terms of documentation that you have to submit in order to get one, including demonstrating, a captain's license or something along those lines. Those are not things that people can just go out and get overnight I would offer that the reason you see that active versus total permits there is because most people that have a captain's license and own a boat have already gone out and gotten this open access permit. They already own it. So I don't think the speculative behavior would be a bunch more people going out and getting permits. To the contrary, what I am concerned about occurring is some of those people that are not active right now just deciding to begin reporting trips, become active as a speculative behavior, which is going to skew the data that the council has moving forward for decision making. So I appreciate those words being allowed to be said on the record here today. Appreciate the conversation around the table, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Any more discussion on the motion? Are you ready for the question? Motion is moved to request the National Marine Fisheries establish control dates for the recreational for hire fisheries for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. The control dates for all 4 species will be as soon as possible and as early as February 11th, 2025. All those in favor, please raise your hand on the computer and leave it up. And if Stephen or Chris or somebody will verify my count, I'd appreciate it. I got 15. Does that sound correct?
I have 16.
I had 16.
16.
16. Yeah.
All right. Everybody put their hands down, please. All those opposed, raise your hands. I see one. Any abstentions? Ken, please put your hand down. Any abstentions? One. Motion passes 16-1-1. Kylie, anything else you need to bring before us?
No, thank you. That's it.
All right, with that, thank you very much, Kylie. Let's move on to our next agenda item, legal review, financial disclosure, and recusal training. John Almeida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess if my PowerPoint is going to be put up.
Did you want to share it or did you want me to?
If you could, I'd appreciate it.
All right. Give me just a second here.
Thank you.
All right, you should be good.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning and welcome to the 2025 briefing on council members' financial disclosures and recusals. Where we get new council members on board every year, I think it's a good idea to go through this. And for council members who have heard it before, I ask for your indulgence. And where some of the points here are somewhat complex, I do think it's a good idea to walk through this for everyone each year. Next slide, please. At their core, government ethics statutes and regulations are about ensuring that public officials place the public interest over private gain. Taxpayers reasonably expect that public officials are not in their positions for their own private interests, and the framework we have in place helps to ensure that that will happen. It's important to recognize that federal ethics regulations are not the same as our everyday understanding of ethics, which are based on personal moral codes. Federal ethics regulations are strict rules that everyone must follow, regardless of whether we personally believe we can be objective in our decision making. Next slide, please. The statutes and regulations are very strict for federal officials when it comes to working on matters in which an official has a personal financial stake. This slide shows the default standard for federal officials, and the default is do it. And if we do, we face criminal or civil penalties. Council members are considered federal officials for purposes of federal ethics rules. Next slide, please. Now, the Magnuson-Stevens Act gives council members an exception to this blanket prohibition on working on matters where there's a personal financial interest. This is largely because in setting up the council system, Congress decided that it wanted to have people with expertise in fisheries management. And if the strict default standards applied, we likely wouldn't have that kind of expertise. Next slide, please. Section 302J of Magnuson sets up the requirement that council members must disclose their financial interests and must recuse themselves from voting on matters where there would be a, quote, significant and predictable effect on their financial interests. This standard is different from the default federal ethics statute that we saw a few slides ago. The default standard is no involvement where there's anything above a minimal financial interest. Magnuson's standard, though, allows for involvement of a council member as long as it doesn't have a significant and predictable effect. Again, Congress presumably did this in order to ensure that we have people with expertise and experience sitting at the council table working on fisheries issues, as the default standard would likely require a lot more recusals. And as this slide notes, the standard here applies to council members, but not to NIMFs or state officials. Next slide, please. The disclosure of financial interest is the key to the Magnuson ethics framework. Disclosures put everything out in front so members of the public can understand where council members are coming from. Which fisheries are they involved in? What companies do they work for or own? Disclosing your involvement allows your participation in discussions and deliberations, even in a situation where you might ultimately have to recuse yourself. Next slide, please. So whose interests must be disclosed? Your own interests, your spouse, your minor children, your partners, and any organization where you serve as officer, director, trustee, partner, or employee. In this context, partner means a business partner as opposed to a romantic partner. Next slide, please. As for the timing of disclosures, we need them every year by February 1st. And when you join the council, it needs to happen within 45 days. But, and this is important, if things change, we need to get revised disclosures within 30 days of the changes. And you know, things do change for folks over the course of a year, and we do need to update those disclosures within 30 days. Next slide, please. Importantly, the failure to disclose or providing false disclosures are violations of Magnuson, which can result in civil penalties, permit sanctions, and removal from the council. This could also result in the provisions of Section 208 kicking in, meaning potential civil or criminal penalties. Next slide, please. There are three general categories of required disclosures. The first is the most common one we look at, and that's ownership or employment in a company or vessel engaged in a fishery managed by a council. The second is employment in an organization whose members are engaged in a fishery managed by a council. The third is ownership or employment in a company that owns or is owned by another company engaged in a fishery managed by the council. And this third category relating to indirect ownership gets to the more, the more challenging, complicated calculations and figuring out attribution that we're going to discuss later on in the presentation. There are two other categories that don't appear on this slide because they're less common. And the first one is ownership or employment in a company that provides essential services or equipment for a fishery managed by the council. And the second is employment or ownership in a company that provides representational, consulting, or legal services for other vessels or companies providing essential services or involved in the harvest, fishing activities managed by the in a fishery managed by the council. Next slide, please. Information on council members' employment or ownership interests are used to determine if the thresholds are met, such that there's a need for recusal from voting. Recusal means not participating in voting, and that's not the same as abstaining. Next slide, please. With a finding of a conflict of interest, a council chair cannot allow a conflicted member to vote. Such individuals are permitted to state for the record how they would have voted if they weren't conflicted out. Importantly, recused council members are permitted to participate in deliberations after notifying the council that they're going to be recused and identifying the financial interest leading to the recusal. So even with a recusal, while you ultimately aren't permitted to vote, you are allowed to participate in the discussions. Next slide, please. NOAA GC will make the recusal determinations and will rely on information provided in the financial disclosure form, along with other reliable and probative information. And this can involve discussions with the affected individual. Next slide, please. So how do these recusal discussions get started? It's usually by the request of a council member, but they can come about by NOAA GC initiating the process. Chris and I will talk before council meetings, and if there's a pending issue that might lead me to starting the analysis. Of course, I would urge council members to contact me if there's a question, and the more lead time we have, the better. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to get into the heart of this. When are recusals required? And you'll see the answer here. And note the bolded phrases. Magnuson tells us that recusal is required where there's a council decision that would have a significant and predictable effect on financial interests that are required to be disclosed. Next slide, please. So to walk through the bolded phrases on the prior slide, it's a multi-step determination to figure out if someone needs to be recused. And if any of the answers here come out no, then there's no need to recuse yourself, and that's the end of the analysis. And we'll walk through these steps in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay, the first question, is there a council decision? The regulations define council decision as we see it here in this slide. Approval of an FMP or an FMP amendment, request to regional administrator for changes to regulations, finding of an emergency and request for emergency action, and comments on a secretarial FMP or FMP amendment. So if you don't have one of these actions, then we don't have a council decision from which you need to be recused. So again, if there's a no answer to any of these questions, then that's the end of the analysis. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, the critical phrase here, significant and predictable effect. The statute tells us that there's a significant and predictable effect when there's a close causal link between the council decision and an expected and substantially disproportionate benefit to a council member's financial interests relative to other participants in the fishery. And once again, these two highlighted phrases are fleshed out in the regulations. Next slide, please. Close causal link is defined as when a council decision would be reasonably expected to directly impact or affect the financial interests of an affected individual. The regulations flesh this out a bit, telling us that where there are regulations, implementing regulations associated with a council decision, there's generally going to be a presumption of a close causal link. And where there are no implementing regulations, there's generally a presumption that there is not a close causal link. And of course, any presumption hinges on the facts of the situation. You could have a situation where there are regulations, but it still doesn't, it still might be speculative that they'll have a connection to council members' financial interest. So you don't have that close causal link. And then the flip side could happen where there's no regulations, but you could find a causal connection to a council member's financial interests. But you do have those presumptions when you have regs or you don't have regs. Next slide, please. Okay, the next key phrase, an expected and substantially disproportionate benefit, and that's described in the regulations as a positive or negative impact with regard to a council decision that's likely to affect a fishery or a sector of a fishery in which the affected individual has a significant financial interest. So next slide. What is a significant financial interest? And this is basically the magic number of 10%. If you have greater than 10% interest in the harvest, marketing, or processing of a fishery affected by a council decision, or ownership of greater than 10% of the vessels using the same kind of gear type affected by a council decision, that's considered significant financial interest, 10%. Next slide, please. All right, now we're going to get into attribution, and this is about trying to figure out how much of an interest will be imputed on a council member. We'll look at 4 common situations here, and the first 2 are pretty straightforward. The second 2 can get complicated. So direct ownership. For a council member's direct ownership in a company, the percentage of ownership will be used to calculate how much interest a council member has in a fishery. So if a council member owns 10% of a company that has a 50% interest in harvesting a particular fishery managed by a council, then that council member will get a 5% attribution of that fishery. So that's below the 10% threshold. Now with employment, you're going to get a full attribution of the company's, of the employer's interest. So all of a council member's employer's interest will be considered for recusal purposes. So if a council member works for a company that has a 50% interest in harvesting a particular fishery, then that council member will get attributed all 50% of that interest, which is above the 10% threshold. The next one, indirect ownership. So if you have a company with ownership in another company, it's proportional attribution. So if a council member owns 50% of a company and that company owns 50% of another company, then the council member will be attributed 25% of the second company's interests. So, to the extent that that second company harvests 50% of a fishery, then the council member will get 25% of that fishery. And then the last situation here, parent ownership. So you're a company that owns a part of a council member's company. It's going to be attributed you're going to get full attribution if the parent company owns more than half, owns 50% or more of the council member's company. So with these, these attribution things, particularly when you're talking about indirect ownership and parent ownership, the calculations can get complicated and convoluted. So again, emphasize the importance of early consideration so we can give it a good, thorough run down these issues thoroughly. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an important point here. If there isn't a specific percentage of ownership listed, then the presumption is going to be 100% ownership. And as you probably can figure out from that last slide, you can see why this is important and why you should always have the accurate listing of percentage of ownership, just so you don't automatically get this presumption of 100% ownership. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next situation where you have an employee, and you're employed by a fishing organization or a fishing association. There's no attribution from other members' fishing activities, but if the association itself engages in a fishery, then the association's activity would be attributed to the council member. And then when you're considering the ownership interests of a spouse, a partner, or a minor child, we use proportional attribution described earlier. But for employment purposes, not ownership, for employment of a spouse, minor child, or partner, that doesn't get attributed to council members unless the compensation of that employment fluctuates based on the financial performance of the company. So if it's straight salary or an hourly wage, it doesn't get attributed to the council member. But if the compensation is tied to how the company does, then it does get attributed to the council member. Next slide, please. And I mentioned this earlier. You can participate in the committee process. You can participate in the council discussions and motions leading up to a final decision. You can even participate in discussions and deliberations on a vote for a final action. You just need to announce your recusal, and you can participate and even announce how you would have voted if you weren't recused. Next slide, please. There's one more basis for recusal, and this one is pretty rare in application. If a council is considering a matter that's primarily an individual concern of a council member, then a council member must be recused and cannot participate in deliberations. Again, this is a rare situation, and the example is something like a grant or a contract that would be awarded by the council if the council member is, the recipient of that grant or contract, then that would require a strict recusal under the default. Remember earlier in the presentation, the default standards that would apply, and that this is not one where the council member could participate in discussions. This one, the best practice would be for the council member to leave the room when this is happening. As far as a fishery decision where this type of recusal would take place, it would have to be a fishery with very few participants or an issue in a fishery that affected very few companies or vessels. And one of those vessels is owned by a council member. So again, this is a rare one, and this is a more strict consequence than the default Magnuson or than the Magnuson recusal provisions. Next slide, please. And if there's a disagreement with a recusal determination, that determination can be appealed to the NOAA General Counsel. And once again, the earlier we start the process, the better, because the General Counsel has 30 days to decide. And if we don't start the process until, right before a council meeting, it could be too late. And as the slide notes here, a reversal of a recusal determination can't undo a vote that's already happened. Next slide, please. Okay, when there are recusals, typically they're on the record at council meetings, but the agency also provides an annual report to Congress with information on these decisions. And next slide, please. Here are some resources relating to recusal issues. Shelley put some materials into the briefing book. There's a frequently asked questions document that actually pulls together a lot of what I talked about today. And I'd recommend, folks hanging on to that or, taking a look at that if you have if things come up over the year. It's a good starting place. But thank you for giving me the time to cover this again, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if I'm able to.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John? Jim Gilmore?
Thanks, Chairman. And John, that was a great presentation. Very, very helpful. If there is, say, a council member that maybe declared he did not have an interest in a particular financial thing, whatever, and it turns out somebody knew that they did, and they wanted to report it, is that reported to you or general counsel at NOAA Fisheries, or is there a separate federal organization that gets it, that it would report to? Thanks.
A lot of times people will raise issues like that or just questions about recusals to me, and I think that's the way it should go. I'm not sure if there are other places people could bring it, but yeah, to the extent that there's a question about, whether there should be a recusal determination made, that those should be brought to me.
Anything else for John? Seeing nothing else, thank you very much, John.
All right, thank you.
And with that, it looks like we're at our lunch break now. So let's all come back at 1 o'clock. I'm assuming everybody's restaurants is pretty close to where they're sitting right now, so 1 o'clock shouldn't be a problem. And we'll come back at 1 o'clock.